All right, so today we are jumping into one of the great intellectual puzzles of the 20th century. It's a story that's all about hope, disillusionment, and this really profound search for who or what can actually change the world when things don't go according to plan. Okay, let's get into it. This is the question that really haunted an entire generation of thinkers. Marx's prediction, it seemed so clear. The proletariat, the working class, they would rise up and overthrow capitalism. But as the 20th century rolled on, something else happened, especially in the West. The revolution just went missing. And the big question is, where did it go? So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at why that revolution went silent. Then we'll dive into the search for a new hope, a new force for change. We'll see how that search led to a major disagreement, what we're calling Adorno's doubt. From there, we'll dig into a powerful critique of this whole idea, framing it as a dream of the West. And finally, we'll ask, where does that leave us today? Okay, so let's set the scene. It's the post-war boom. Capitalism isn't collapsing. It's absolutely thriving. And the working class, instead of getting ready for revolution, they seem to be getting pretty comfortable, buying new cars, new TVs. For thinkers on the left, this was a huge crisis. It was like the main character in their story had just decided to walk off stage. And this is where the philosopher Herbert Marcuse comes in. In his massive 1964 book, One-Dimensional Man, he offered a pretty radical diagnosis. He argued that modern society had cooked up this new, much more subtle way of controlling people. It wasn't just about police force anymore. It was about seduction. By creating this whole world of consumer goods and entertainment, the system manufactured what he called false needs. That constant desire for the new phone, the better car. These things, he said, actually tie you into capitalism. They make you a happy participant, not a revolutionary. And the result? A society that kind of swallows up all opposition. A one-dimensional world where real radical change feels almost impossible. And this is the really crucial question. If your traditional hero, the industrial worker, is no longer in the picture, what do? Just give up? Well, for Marcuse, the answer was absolutely not. You start looking for a new one. You search for the cracks in the system, for the people who haven't been completely bought in. And this slide shows you exactly where he looked. Marcuse turned his attention to the edges, to the people who were living outside that comfortable one-dimensional society. He saw real potential in the outcasts, in persecuted minorities, and especially in the radical students who were starting to protest things like the Vietnam War. But his biggest hope, that was placed much, much further away, in the anti-colonial and liberation movements fighting Western power all across the globe. And you can just feel the passion in Marcuse's words here. This wasn't some dry academic theory for him, no way. For Marcuse, what was happening in places like Cuba and Vietnam was proof. It was a moral beacon. It showed that resistance was still possible, that a different kind of humanity could actually stand up to the overwhelming force of the system. He really believed their struggle could be the spark that would reignite the fight back home. But here is the thing. Marcuse's big pivot towards activism, his celebration of these new revolutionary forces, well, it created a massive rift with his oldest friend and intellectual partner, Theodor Adorno. Because while Marcuse saw the sparks of a new revolution, Adorno saw something else entirely. And it led to one of the most famous intellectual breakups of the 20th century. And this chart right here just lays the whole conflict bare. When students erupted in the late 1960s, Marcuse was their champion. He saw their protests as this deep, meaningful rejection of a totally rotten culture. Adorno? He was deeply, deeply skeptical. He thought their actions were simplistic, that they lacked any real theoretical grounding. And the breaking point, it came when students occupied his institute in Frankfurt. Adorno, to the horror of many on the left, did the unthinkable. He called the police. For Marcuse, this was a total betrayal. For Adorno, it was a necessary defense against what he called actionism, just mindless action.
Now, to really get why Adorno would do that, you have to understand his core philosophy. His entire life's work, what he called negative dialectics, it was built on this profound pessimism. He'd lived through the rise of fascism, and he was convinced that society was so messed up, so dominated by irrationality, that any simple positive solution was probably just going to make things worse. So his job, as he saw it, wasn't to offer a political program or point to a new hero. It was to just relentlessly critique, to poke holes in everything. For him, this whole search for a new revolutionary subject was a dangerous fantasy.
And Adorno's skepticism kind of opens the door to an even bigger critique, not just of Marcuse's specific hopes, but of the entire intellectual trend that put its faith in these anti-colonial movements. And that movement had a name: Third Worldism. The term itself is pretty interesting. It was actually invented in Paris back in the 50s. The idea was to draw a direct line between the colonized peoples of the world and the Third Estate, the commoners who kicked off the French Revolution. And this idea was electric. It suggested that here, right here, was the new historical force that was going to topple the old order. It became this incredibly powerful ideology for Western radicals, who, feeling let down by their own societies, started to see the guerrilla fighter as the new proletariat, the new hero of history. And this quote, man, it just cuts right to the heart of the critique. The argument here is that Third Worldism was never really about the complicated, messy realities of life in Africa or Asia or Latin America. Nope, it was a projection, a dream of the West. It was all about Western guilt over colonialism and this desperate need for redemption. Western radicals were basically looking into the mirror of these anti-colonial struggles and seeing a reflection, not of other people, but of their own hopes and their own failures. So a really central figure in all this was Frantz Fanon. He was a psychiatrist from Martinique who actually joined the Algerian Revolution. And he made this powerful argument that the violence of colonialism was so dehumanizing that the only way to restore the dignity of the colonized was through counterviolence. And in the West, this idea wasn't just read, it was devoured. It became almost like a holy text, offering this path to purification through embracing a kind of righteous anti-colonial violence. It was less about real solidarity and more, as one critic put it, about a kind of ecstatic ritual of self-flagellation. So what's the big takeaway from this critique? Well, the argument is that this way of thinking had some really dangerous consequences. It totally romanticized the guerrilla fighter, which meant turning a blind eye to the often brutal realities of these movements. At its absolute worst, it led Western intellectuals to make excuses for truly monstrous regimes like the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, simply because they were anti-Western. Real human suffering basically became a backdrop, a kind of stage for the West's own ideological drama. It was spectacle, not solidarity.
And so, here we are. We've come full circle, from the quiet factories of the West to the jungles of Vietnam, and all the way back to the skeptical intellectual circles of Europe. The journey we've been on is one filled with uncertainty.
Really, when you boil it down, the whole story of Marcuse and Adorno is this search, this quest to find a subject of history, that group or that force that can actually bring about massive change. It's shifted. It's moved from the factory worker to the student protester to the anti-colonial fighter. And each time that hope was met with new problems, new critiques, and new disappointments, leaving the question completely fundamentally unresolved. And that leaves us with this final, pretty massive question. The big ideas of the 20th century, well, they seem to have run their course. The old answers just don't seem to fit anymore. So, as we look at the huge global challenges we're facing now, from climate change to massive inequality, we have to wonder, who is the we that can actually do something? If the worker, the student, and the guerrilla all failed to play the part, who, if anyone, can be the subject of global change today? That's something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this one.